I never thought I'd post this anywhere. For years, I convinced myself that what happened that night belonged in the past, buried under bad decisions, sleepless nights, and the lies I told myself to keep moving forward. But lately I've been reading stories in confession forums, seeing strangers admit things they've carried for decades, and it made me wonder whether keeping silent has really helped me at all. My name is William. What I'm about to describe is the most serious crime I ever committed. It happened 12 years ago, during one of the worst periods of my life. I was 31, drowning in debt, angry at the world, and desperate enough to believe that desperation excused almost anything. I had lost my job 6 months earlier. The bank was calling every day. My apartment felt smaller with every unpaid bill that landed in my mailbox. The person at the center of this story was a man named Victor. Victor wasn't a friend, though we knew each other. We had worked together years before, and I knew things about him that most people didn't. He had money. A lot more than he admitted. He distrusted banks, and liked keeping cash hidden in places only he knew about. At least, that's what I believed. For months I obsessed over the idea. While other people searched for solutions, I searched for shortcuts. Every time I passed Victor's neighborhood, I imagined what might be inside his house. Every overdue notice made the temptation stronger. Then one rainy evening I saw something that changed everything. Victor left town. I remember standing across the street under a bus shelter, watching him load suitcases into his car. He drove away just before sunset. I should have forgotten it. Instead, I followed the thought that had been poisoning my mind for months. That was the moment the crime truly began. Not when I entered the house, not when laws were broken, but when I decided that another person's life was something I could exploit for my own benefit. A week later, an unexpected visitor would arrive in the middle of the night. And after that, nothing would go according to plan. For several days after seeing Victor leave town, I couldn't stop thinking about his house. It became an obsession. I'd wake up thinking about it, and fall asleep imagining what was hidden inside. Looking back, I realize I was searching for permission to do something I already wanted to do. I started making excuses for myself. Victor was wealthy. I was broke. He probably wouldn't even notice a missing stack of cash. That's the kind of nonsense I repeated until it sounded reasonable. The truth was simpler. I was jealous and desperate. I began driving through his neighborhood at different hours. Nothing dramatic, just observing. I noted when the street was busy, when it was quiet, and which houses kept their lights on late. I even walked past pretending to be on a phone call while studying the property. The more information I gathered, the more confident I became. That confidence was dangerous. What started as a fantasy slowly transformed into a real plan, complete with timing, routes, and backup options. For the first time, I wasn't merely imagining a crime. I was preparing to commit one. The week before I acted, I treated the whole thing like a project. That sounds cold, but it's the truth. Every evening after returning home, I'd sit at my kitchen table with a notebook and write down details I'd noticed during my drives through Victor's neighborhood. I wasn't some professional criminal. In fact, I had never done anything remotely like this before. That made me nervous enough to overthink everything. I planned simple things: where I would park, which streets I would avoid, and how long I intended to stay. My goal was to enter quietly, search quickly, and leave before anyone noticed. The preparation gave me a false sense of control. Each item I checked off my list made the plan feel safer and smarter, even though it was either. The night I chose was a Thursday. Rain was forecast, and fewer people tended to be outside when the weather was bad. As the date approached, my stomach twisted with anxiety. Part of me hoped something would stop me. Another part was already committed. Thursday arrived colder than expected. By late evening, rain was falling steadily, turning the streets shiny and empty. I remember sitting in my car several blocks from Victor's house, staring through the windshield and wondering whether I still had time to turn around. For nearly 20 minutes, I did nothing. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my neck. Every reasonable thought in my head told me to start the engine and drive home. Instead, I convinced myself that I had already come too far to quit. That is a dangerous lie. Nobody is ever too far gone to make a better decision. Eventually, I left the car and walked through the rain. The neighborhood was quiet. Most windows were dark. The weather muffled distant sounds, making everything feel strangely isolated. When I reached Victor's property, I paused near the side of the house and listened. Nothing. No voices. No television. No movement. The place appeared completely empty. At that moment, standing in the darkness, I believed the hardest part was over. I couldn't have been more wrong. Crossing the threshold felt unreal. One moment I was standing outside in the rain, and the next I was inside a dark, silent house that didn't belong to me. I froze for several seconds, listening for any sign that someone was there. Nothing. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. My eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness. Every small sound seemed amplified: the creak of a floorboard, the rustle of my jacket, even my own breathing. I moved carefully from room to room, trying to stay calm. The plan was simple: find the cash I believed Victor kept hidden, take it, and leave. The reality was much different. I had no idea where to begin. Drawers contained ordinary paperwork. Cabinets held nothing useful. Several minutes passed, and frustration started replacing fear. Then I noticed something unusual in a study near the back of the house. A desk drawer was locked. For some reason, that immediately captured my attention. My pulse quickened. After all the empty rooms and dead ends, it felt like the first real clue. I became determined to find out what was inside. I was kneeling beside the desk, focused entirely on the locked drawer, when I heard a sound that instantly drained the blood from my face. A door closing. Not inside the room. Somewhere else in the house. At first, I thought I had imagined it. My nerves were stretched so tight that every creak seemed suspicious. I stayed perfectly still and listened. Then I heard footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Real. Panic hit me like a wave. Victor was supposed to be out of town. The house was supposed to be empty. That assumption was the foundation of my entire plan, and suddenly it no longer seemed true. I switched off my flashlight and remained crouched in the darkness. The footsteps continued. Whoever had entered wasn't moving like a homeowner returning unexpectedly. They seemed cautious, almost as if they were trying not to be heard. That realization terrified me even more. I wasn't alone. Someone else had come to the house in the middle of the night. An uninvited guest had arrived, and I had absolutely no idea who they were or why they were there. My first instinct was to run. The problem was that reaching the nearest exit meant crossing an open hallway, and whoever had entered the house sounded close. I felt trapped. My mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Maybe Victor had returned unexpectedly. Maybe a neighbor had noticed something and come to investigate. Or maybe this person was doing exactly what I was doing. I slipped behind a large bookshelf in the study and tried to control my breathing. Every second felt painfully slow. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped somewhere nearby. Silence. The kind of silence that makes you aware of every heartbeat. Then a narrow beam of light swept across the hallway outside. Someone was using a flashlight. That ruled out Victor. A homeowner doesn't search their own house like that. The stranger moved cautiously from room to room. I could hear drawers opening and closing. Whoever they were, they seemed to be looking for something. Suddenly, I wasn't just a burglar hiding in someone else's home. I was a burglar hiding from another intruder. And that changed everything. For several minutes, I stayed hidden behind the bookshelf, barely moving. The stranger continued searching nearby rooms. The sounds came and went: footsteps, drawers, the occasional bump against furniture. Then everything went wrong. As I shifted my weight, my shoulder brushed against a decorative vase sitting on a shelf beside me. It tipped. I caught it for a fraction of a second, but not well enough. The vase hit the floor. The crash echoed through the house. Immediately, the flashlight beam snapped toward the study doorway. I heard the stranger stop moving. Then came a voice. "Who's there?" My stomach dropped. I didn't answer. A few seconds later, the flashlight entered the room. The beam swept across the walls, the desk, and finally toward my hiding place. I realized I couldn't stay concealed much longer. The stranger saw movement. I saw a silhouette. For one brief moment, we stared at each other in complete shock. Neither of us had expected company. Then the stranger turned and ran. Instinct took over. Instead of escaping, I chased after them, driven by panic and the fear that they might identify me or call the police. The chase lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. The stranger sprinted down the hallway, knocking into furniture as they went. I followed without thinking. Fear had completely overridden reason. All I could focus on was stopping them before they escaped and reported what they had seen. Rain hammered against the windows as we raced through the dark house. Then disaster struck. The stranger slipped near the back entrance. I heard a sharp crash followed by a painful cry. Momentum carried me forward, and I nearly fell as well. Everything suddenly stopped. The person was on the floor, clutching one arm and struggling to get up. For a moment neither of us moved. The adrenaline that had fueled the chase drained away, replaced by a horrible realization. This wasn't some movie. Real people could get hurt. The stranger looked terrified. Honestly, I probably looked the same. I backed away a step, unsure what to do. Help them? Run? Call someone? Before I could decide, headlights flashed through a nearby window. Someone outside had arrived. And neither of us was prepared for what came next. The headlights stopped in front of the house. For a second, I hoped it was a passing car. Then I saw flashes of blue reflecting across the wet windows. Police. To this day, I don't know whether a neighbor reported suspicious activity, whether someone noticed movement inside, or whether the stranger had been under surveillance for unrelated reasons. All I knew was that law enforcement was outside and I was standing in a house I had no business being in. The injured stranger saw the lights too. We exchanged a look that said everything. Two people with completely different reasons for being there had suddenly become united by the same problem. Panic took over again. Instead of making a smart decision, I made several stupid ones in rapid succession. I ignored the injured person, rushed toward the rear of the house, and searched desperately for a way out. Outside, voices echoed through the rain. I heard a car door slam. Then another. The officers were approaching the house. For the first time that night, the possibility of getting caught stopped feeling hypothetical. It felt inevitable. I found a rear exit and pushed through it without thinking twice. The cold rain hit me immediately. Within seconds, my clothes were soaked, but I barely noticed. My entire focus was on getting away before anyone saw me. Behind me, voices shouted from inside the house. I couldn't make out the words. I didn't stop to listen. The backyard opened onto a narrow stretch of trees separating the property from another street. I stumbled through mud, slipped twice, and nearly lost a shoe. Every distant sound felt like an officer closing in. The irony wasn't lost on me. For months, I had imagined the crime itself as the frightening part. Instead, the real terror came afterward. As I reached the next street, I forced myself to slow down. Running openly would attract attention. So I walked, trying to appear normal despite my soaked clothes and racing heart. No sirens followed. No one called out. For the first time that night, I believed I might actually get away. But escaping the house turned out to be much easier than escaping what happened inside it. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the stranger falling, heard the crash of the vase, and imagined police officers knocking on my door. By sunrise, I had convinced myself that my arrest was only a matter of hours away. The knock never came. Instead, I spent the morning glued to local news sites and community forums, searching for any mention of the incident. By afternoon, I found something. A brief report stated that police had responded to a suspected break-in at a private residence. One individual had been detained at the scene after suffering a minor injury while attempting to flee. One individual. Not two. I read those words over and over. The stranger had been caught. I hadn't. The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming, which was quickly followed by something else: guilt. Someone else was facing questions, embarrassment, and legal consequences while I sat safely in my apartment pretending nothing had happened. That realization stayed with me. In many ways, it haunted me more than the possibility of being arrested. Weeks passed, then months. No investigator ever contacted me. No witness identified me. From a legal standpoint, I had escaped the consequences of my actions. Psychologically, it wasn't that simple. I became obsessed with small reminders of that night. Every police car made my stomach tighten. Every unexpected knock at my apartment door sent a surge of anxiety through my chest. Even harmless questions from coworkers sometimes felt like hidden accusations. The strangest part was that I hadn't even accomplished what I set out to do. I never found any money. I never opened the locked drawer. I never gained anything tangible from the crime. Yet I carried the stress of it for years. The experience changed how I viewed myself. Before that night, I liked to think I was fundamentally decent, just unlucky and struggling. Afterward, I couldn't hide behind that story anymore. I had crossed the line voluntarily. Desperation may have influenced my choices, but it hadn't forced them. That distinction became harder and harder to ignore as time went on. As the years passed, the fear gradually faded, but the lesson remained. For a long time, I blamed circumstances for what happened. I blamed debt, unemployment, bad luck, and even Victor himself. It was easier to point at external problems than admit the uncomfortable truth that the final decision had been mine. Eventually, I stopped doing that. One realization changed everything. Thousands of people experience financial hardship without breaking into someone else's home. My situation explained my thinking, but it did not excuse my actions. I also spent years wondering about the stranger. Who were they? Why were they there? What happened after the police arrived? I never found out. Sometimes I imagined that they were just as desperate as I had been. Other times I suspected they were far more experienced than me. Either way, our lives briefly collided because of choices either of us should have made. Looking back, the most dangerous part wasn't the crime itself. It was the slow process of convincing myself that a bad idea was somehow reasonable. That's how many terrible decisions begin. If you've read this far, you're probably expecting some dramatic ending. There isn't one. I was never arrested. I never stood before a judge. In the eyes of the law, I slipped through the cracks that night and disappeared into the rain. But getting away with something doesn't erase it. The version of me that entered Victor's house believed that consequences only mattered if you were caught. The older version writing this confession understands that some consequences arrive regardless. They settle into your memory, your habits, and the way you see yourself. For years, I carried the knowledge that I had willingly become the kind of person I once criticized. That realization was uncomfortable, but it forced me to be honest about my own flaws. So here's my advice. If desperation is pushing you toward a decision you know is wrong, stop before you cross the line. The problem you're trying to solve may be temporary. The memory of what you do can last a lifetime. That's the lesson I learned from one rainy night, an unexpected guest, and a crime that changed me forever.